Leadership is unique to each person, and today we'd like you to consider that having high expectations for fund advisory committee members pays dividends in your high-quality recruitment process. If you start the recruitment conversation with, you don't have to spend much time on this, or we only meet once in a while, this isn't a big deal. You may be setting low expectations and never be able to attain the commitment that you want from your FAC members. Leaders in McCook have set expectations very high for their FAC members by modeling the way, leading from example, and valuing the many talents that their FAC members have. Our next speakers are going to share their secrets to success for their fund advisory committee. Our first speaker is McCook FAC Treasurer Mark Graff, who has also served as the Nebraska Community Foundation Board Chair. Mark is going to also have a PowerPoint slide with his presentation today. Mark, the floor is yours. I'm complete.
Thanks, Denise. I chose to have a PowerPoint presentation because it gets my mug off the screen, so I think that's a really good idea. I know most of you have been waiting for over a month for this presentation, so I hope I meet expectations. As David Letterman used to say, wake up the kids, this is going to be good. So now that I set my expectations unrealistically high, let me start. I'm a kind of a bullet point kind of guy. So what I've done for my presentation today is kind of narrowed down to what I think 6 essence of leadership is. As old as I am, I've got plenty of years of experience, looking at studying leaders, reviewing leaders, learning from leaders. I've had the privilege really of learning from one of the best that there is, I think, in the business, and that's the speaker you'll hear next, which is Cindy Huff. And so some of these I'll talk about how Cindy handles it, her leadership efforts in such a great manner. But we'll get started. The first one is don't ever underestimate a community's capacity. And as I go through these 6 bullet points, I'll kind of talk and maybe give you a little example of how, where this is applicable in McCook and how I came across this as one of my key cornerstones. Example is when we entered, we were one of the first of four communities that took on the challenge from the Sherwood Foundation several years ago. When we went into that, none of us on our FAC had ever been involved really in a deep campaign effort, and so when we were given the opportunity to raise $500,000 to get the $250,000 match, it was daunting. We thought, there's this. We're newbies at this. We don't know what we're doing. We can't get to that level. But we knew our expectations had to be high. You don't ever try to, put them so low that you'll easily shoot over them. So you try to set them high enough that it takes a challenge to reach them. So we set it was a full 500,000. We reached that. And I think from that, we kind of learned that, always kind of set those expectations high because you can achieve them. Second really is the need to measure, to set quantifiable goals. I think it's been said, what is measured is accomplished. And I think that's true so much. An example is when we went through our strategic planning efforts at the FAC a few years back, we set I think it was like a $5 million goal for our foundation in 10 years. And what seemed like then was a crazy goal. We're within reach of reaching that already. And it's been much less than the 10 years. So again, part of that reason that we reach for that, or we're able to get as close as we are, is because we quantified that goal. The next is it has to be a team effort. The one thing I've learned is it's important to listen. As my dad once told me, he said, Mark, the reason that God gave you such huge ears and relative to the size of your head is so that you'll understand the need to listen a lot more than you talk. Cindy, our chairman, who you'll hear from next, does a great job of this. She understands that our FAC is made up of a lot of different personalities. Some are very free to express their thoughts. Some are very reserved. So what she does is she meets individually with our FAC and gets input from them on an individual basis, especially those that don't speak a lot during our FAC meetings. So she does a great job of listening. She doesn't ever, when she meets with us, she doesn't ever control the conversation. She lets us control the conversation. Just an excellent cornerstone of leadership. The next one, I think it's important to have a good orientation process for new members. We started this a couple of years ago, and through it, we've kind of developed our succession planning for leadership. All of our current FAC members have been involved in the committee structure prior to joining our FAC, so it helped them to orient to what we're all about and get a good feel for not only FAC members, but for what our foundation fund's about. And so a good orientation process so that they understand, they feel comfortable when they join the FAC. I think that's important. Next is focus during meetings. The one thing I think, I've been chairman of several boards over, because I've been around so long, I've been chairman of several boards over my life. And the one thing that's hardest for me as chairman is when to cut off that conversation. You have good conversation, but you have to accomplish certain things during a meeting. And so it's very important to really focus on what's important during that meeting. And then at times you'll have to cut off conversations because you have to move on. And so it's very difficult. It's a challenge to know when that time is to move on or when to cut off conversations, but it's very important because focus is so important during a meeting. And the last thing I want to talk about is just to have a defined meeting agenda. We have a youth group here in McCook that we formed about 10 years ago. And I think the one thing we taught them up front, because part of the purpose of identifying these youth we wanted future leaders in our community. And one of the things we learned up front was it's important to have a defined meeting agenda for our youth. They need to know what's going to go on at the meeting so that they can prepare for it, so that they can focus on those items. So it's very important. I think as Will Rogers said, if you don't know where you're going, you're going to get there. And I think that's so true, especially in that. So that's kind of my 6 cornerstones of leadership. So I guess I'll be available for questions later on if there's any questions in any of those 6. But for now, Denise, I'm complete.
Thanks, Mark. I think there's a lot of power to what you just shared. Let's head next to Cindy Huff, the McCook FAC chair. She's a retired school superintendent, also a very competitive fisherman when in the boat, and an NCF board member. Cindy, I'm complete.
Okay, thank you, Denise. Gosh, that's the most I've ever heard Mark talk about me. So thank you, Mark. I get passionate. I don't use bullet points and other things, and I'll talk with my hands. So sometimes I try to sit on my hands because I just get going because I get passionate about this as our FAC and Nebraska Community Foundation. I'm just going to talk a little bit about your membership. And as you add new members, you need to be specific and very selective about new members. We have developed a matrix that we have all of our current members' strengths, gifts, talents listed, and certain indicators about where they work, where their reach is at. So that gives us a look at what we currently have and lets us know where we need to build, where are those pieces that we really need to hit. This inventory also helps us as a committee to know where we're at as the strengths of our own committee. if anyone would like to see that matrix, I'm sure we can get it to you, and I'm sure NCF also has one. I think the thing as a member is we need to lead by example. An example doesn't mean by talking about what we do. It means by doing it. The way you choose to share your gifts and talents demonstrates to new members your fund's direction and how they can fit into that direction. Like Mark said, we have one-to-one meetings. We have a lot of executive committee meetings. Every member needs to have a burning passion for the work we do. You just cannot be an inactive member on an FAC. If you are, then it's time to maybe move over, but you've got to have that passion. But all your FAC members need to feel valued. And I think as chairs and other people on our leadership group, we need to understand it's not just about us and what we do. It's about including all of our members and making them feel valued. You have to cultivate this connectedness. It doesn't just happen, and it doesn't take a lot of work. It's just sending text, calling to see how they're doing, helping them with what we're all doing, and laughing and having fun and sharing memories of our own families. Make sure everybody has an opportunity for personal input. Some members don't like to talk a lot, but when they do, they usually just really say something that you really want to listen to. So I try to make members understand how valuable their input is. Have each member create their own personal mission statement. We all have developed mission statements. Most strong organizations do. But what personally are you in your FAC for? This is what drives you as a member, and you need to look at that occasionally. I think we all need to remember that encouragement is serious business. It just doesn't happen. Don't dismiss that leadership will happen in your organization either. You have to create leadership. You have to foster leadership. One of the things that I think is cool about the McCook FAC, and Mark alluded earlier to the fact that for 10 years, we've had a youth organization called Youth Chain Reaction. One of the earlier members now sits on our FAC and is on the track to become a leader of our FAC in the near future. So that kind of development can only make your FAC stronger. Also, respect where your foundation has come from. I know my first years sitting on our FAC, I was a little more reserved and quiet because I didn't understand how this worked and how I fit in it. But what I did come to understand was the work that had gone on before I was ever a part. And that is something I never forget as the leadership of those before me that set this up, and what an opportunity for our area. Everybody should have a seat at the table, even past members, and members maybe you're thinking about inviting them to come look and see what it is we do. One of my big pleas that I think is you can't talk the talk until you do the walk. You cannot ask someone to commit to your FAC if you don't demonstrate that commitment yourself. Give. If you have not given, you need to make that commitment to support your FAC and your community through your funds and donations. Making the ask. This is not always easy, but if you haven't made an ask, you can't ask others to make an ask. Make a planned gift. If you don't have a planned gift, then you can't expect others to create one. Act. If you don't act, don't expect others in your fund to act. They need to see that kind of leadership through what you do, not through what you say. And lastly, I would sum it all up by model your commitment, model your FAC development, model by doing, not by saying. Effective leadership just does not happen. You have to lead it. And I am complete.
Cindy, that was great. Thank you for providing this insight as you and Mark really create this passionate culture in the McCook FAC. As Jeff Yost, our CEO, has shared, when it's personal, it is important. And when it is important, it gets done. And the FAC members at McCook make community development work very personal. Steve, why don't you take us into our first breakout question?
Okay, will you let me change it? What we want you to do is talk about what was mentioned, this idea of establishing high expectations for your FAC members and ensuring that they're serving with commitment and passion. And if you're not doing it, talk about how you could do it. What sorts of things could you do or would you do to do that? So I think we'll let Emily go ahead and send people to their breakout rooms. And thank you for your questions. Keep track of those. Continue to put them in chat. We'll get to them when we have the full panel.
Steve is going to introduce our next process. And Steve, you take it away.
Okay, thank you. And thanks, everybody. Please continue to put your questions in the chat box. We will get to them. Next two presenters, for some of you that were at the annual training, you may have heard both Tyler and Al present. And so you've probably heard me introduce them, or at least one of them. Tyler is with the Imperial Community Foundation Fund, and he has been associated or on the FAC for about 8 years. 4 of those as the vice chair, learning the ropes, and now has just assumed the duties of chair. And I think he was even involved with the FAC during high school. Is that right?
Sorry, I lost you there, Steve. What was the question?
Oh, were you on the FAC in high school?
No, I was actually one of the first recipients of a scholarship when I graduated high school, though, and that's how I became familiar with the Foundation Fund.
But the other presenter is Al Stoiter from Johnstown. Al and I both live north of Highway 20 and south of the Niobrara River, and we've got a rock between us, Rock County. So, last time, well, I'll mention that Al's been on the NCF board for almost 9 years now. He's completing his 3rd term, and also was on the Brown County Fund Advisory Committee for 8 years, I believe, and spent 2 of those as chair. He was also chair of the Nebraska Community Foundation Board. So he has a lot of experience with leadership. And if you heard them during Dreams Welcome Week, Al talked more about the macro or the big picture, and Tyler spent a lot of time talking about the details of what their FAC does to kind of maintain high performance. And so to kick us off, rather than have them present again, I'm going to just ask them a couple of questions to get things going, and then we'll bring in Mark and Cindy too, and put all the questions that folks have to the panel. I'm going to start with Al, with the big picture thing. And Al, just to remind you, you talked about how being on the FAC is serious business, and that it should be taken as seriously as if you were on a for-profit board. And you also talked about, the business of the FAC, if I could paraphrase, is developing capacity and human capital and developing opportunities and financial assets to ensure that the community vision can be met successfully. And then you talked about, this is my question going, you talked about bias and personal bias and how that affects leadership. Do you want to respond about how you mean that, or what you were referring to when you talked about bias and the need for new leadership?
Sure. This is Al. And what I would, well, I could just ask, where does what you know come from? And so the way I think of it, you come into the world with a certain innate group of abilities and talents, and then you have a bunch of experience experiences for the rest of your life. And when we all, I think, try to connect those. So leaders bring to an endeavor that set of biases. Those are your personal biases. We all have them. And good leaders, tend to have probably a better share of good biases that are working. But nevertheless, they all get outdated. We all get outdated. We all kind of have a timestamp on our experience and how we connect things in life. And I would just offer that as the fundamental reason that you should have leadership succession on a regular basis. That's one of the reasons, because the next generation is more up to date than you are in the community's vision. They're the ones working hard to make the life for their families and their communities good. And they're 20 years, 30 years more current than most of what you feel. So I just, I like to challenge people on this and just say that, by definition, the next generation is better than the current when it comes to serving their community, for the reasons I mentioned. And I personally have felt that for a long time. I timed out in my professional career at 55 because I was hiring late 20, 30-year-old guys, and I could tell I would be an impediment to them, to doing the best job in leading programs in the conservation business I was in. And I was right. I could give a couple examples if I have time, maybe later.
Okay, great.
I'm complete.
Well, yeah, and I didn't mention that, your career has been as an ecologist, and the one thing that I wrote down was that you said, and you just talked about that, is the next generation is better adapted to the present than we are. And so it's that kind of ecology idea of adapting to what's going on now and thriving in the conditions we have now. And in that way, younger leaders are better adapted for that. Thanks. I've got more questions for you. I'm going to get Tyler's voice in here, and then maybe we'll bring in the other two panelists. Tyler, you talked a lot about the details of what makes your FAC successful, and a lot of it was things that were mentioned by both Mark and Cindy. But I know that a lot of attention goes into your agenda and the timing of your minutes and how you train and the chair. And do you want to talk about some of those kind of the more detailed things in terms of what makes your FAC so effective?
Yeah, I think a lot of my presentation was about it being a well-oiled machine. I just took over as the chair in July of this year, but I was the vice chair for the 4 years previous to that under Elizabeth Harburg, our previous chair. And through that process, I got to learn a lot more of how the sausage is actually made and what makes us such a highly functional machine. And some of that is as simple as just sending out an agenda and having an agenda. A lot of FACs I know will go into a meeting and not know what was going to happen, or the conversation could kind of roam. So we started setting a regularly scheduled meeting. What we do is the first Thursday over the noon hour, and we meet at a restaurant. So it's a working lunch for everybody. And in that limited time frame, we have to get right to work. We'll do the pleasantries, but then it's in order to respect everyone's time. We get right into what that set out agenda is. And sometimes we have a little bit of leftover time to chit chat, but a lot of it is just let's get the real work done, and having an agenda in place. And I like to send it out to everybody in advance so they know exactly what's going to happen. Any grant requests that we receive, I like to send that out in advance so people can come into these meetings informed. And a lot of, in that regard, Doug Gaswick, our treasurer, will send out his financial statements and reports in advance. So all of us are familiar with what money sits there and what we can do with it. So we don't have to spend that time kind of rehashing it at an actual meeting. Our minutes from the meeting go out typically within 24 hours. It's quite amazing. Our secretary, Brianna Pribino, does such a great job getting them sent out. So everything's still fresh in our minds that we can review them, make corrections as we need to. And then we already have them in our inbox for when the next meeting comes around. We can quickly refresh what we did that time before.
Thank you. You also, if you would talk about, and Cindy mentioned the personal commitment, you have folks sign a personal, some sort of commitment to the Fund Advisory Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct. All new FAC members and existing FAC members and officers have signed essentially what is a one-page job description that also details what is expected of them through this commitment. And that gets spelled out a little bit further in a set of operational guidelines that our FAC has adopted earlier this year that really details what the job description for an FAC member is, as well as each of our officers and even ex officio members and student representatives too.
Thank you. I'm going to throw this one out to the entire panel, including Cindy and Mark. And this was a question that Tammy Day from Norfolk asked the last time we did this, which is, how do you retain the history and the deep-seated why when FAC members transition from one generation to another, especially when the startup or original members leave? What do you do to help that FAC click and engage fully? And I'll just let whoever wants to take the first attempt.
I'll try. I think it's important. One of the things that our FAC has is a very strong committee structure. And so I think it's important to get new members involved in the committee before they join the FAC. Our FAC meetings generally last about an hour and a half. 45 minutes if Dennis Berry isn't there. With a shot at the Dennis. I like to give him at least one shot during my presentations. So, we don't have a lot of time to do things. So our committee structure is important. And so I think getting the new or potential FAC members involved in the committees prior to joining the FAC is an important way for them to learn the history and to get a better understanding of that aspect of your FAC, of your fund.
Anybody else, or you want another question? I got one more, and then I'll ask Denise to start feeding the panel the questions from the chat room. And this one's, the whole focus of this is how important it is to have a leadership succession plan and to follow that plan, and why that's important. And I guess the question is, what makes that so important? Because it seems we all know of fund advisory committees that don't have a leadership transition plan that do well. Is there a downside, and is there also a downside when you have a leadership transition that perhaps isn't ready? I don't know if that's a question that you can address or not, but
I'd just like to go back and talk about our last question just a second. I think it's important to have fun, and I think Tyler talking about meeting in a communal atmosphere. I like to make sure we've all laughed at, not because of my funny leadership and I'm in my ineptness, but somebody cracks up something and we all laugh together. And it's that communal feeling that we're here together and we're doing something together, but we're enjoying each other's company. So I think that's important. Ineffective leadership is something that's plagued us for a long time, and many of us have endured through it. Maybe some of my employees have endured through mine, I don't know. But yeah, you got to have that frank conversation, I think, when it's not working. That's a tough one.
And, you know, just to jump off of what Cindy was saying and what Mark presented earlier, is it's all about teamwork. I don't know some of the FAC members, especially our newer ones, all that well, but it is important to have fun and make it a really relaxed atmosphere so everyone feels that their voice can be heard, because they're connected to different parts of the community that I might not be. So in order to build those relationships and then to capitalize on their existing relationships with the rest of the community, I think is really important. And that teamwork just makes everyone more comfortable that, you know, what they have to say at the table is going to either both be heard and, you know, not criticized unfairly by any means. It's a welcome conversation from everybody. And in a year like 2020, that sort of communal bond is something I think we're all missing.
This is Al, and I'll just mention that I think one of the huge benefits of a formal leadership succession plan is just think about how many people in the community you bring in to the effort of community development by continually turning over your fund. So, you know, every new person that you bring on, they have a family probably in the community. And so that's a whole new group of people who understand in detail what you're trying to do and what your role is in the community development business. And, you know, over, like in ours, we turn over every 8 years. We're in the 4th set of that in our committee. I mean, somebody's pretty closely related to all those 24 folks that have gone before us, before the current group. And it just pays a big dividend when you're talking about getting support for new and important community projects.
Al, thank you for that. We do have a question for Tyler from the chat, and we will just have a room for one more question after this one. The question is, can Tyler expand about social interactions outside FAC meetings in Imperial?
Sure. Thanks, Denise. And thank you, Doug. One thing I've proposed, and I think everyone kind of would benefit from that and would certainly have fun at it, is just quarterly social meetings with our FAC members. Like I explained, I don't know a lot of them as well as I could or should, and especially in our small community. But I think just being able to relax and have a beer or a glass of wine or dinner or a coffee in the morning with somebody, I think breaks down some of those barriers that we put up amongst each other, especially if we're not that familiar with them or comfortable with them. So I think those sort of interactions are going to be an important piece to making sure we have both a close-knit FAC, but also that the other parts of the community that I'm not necessarily directly involved with, you know, I hear about what their concerns are, what their needs are, what their wants are, and so we can get them better representation as well on our FAC.
Our last question is how do you effectively move over instead of moving out? And if you could all share your thoughts, we would appreciate that.
That question actually might be directed at me because I've been on the FAC now since inception for about 20 years. So I think maybe Jeff's hinting it's about time to move out. But actually, I actually am scheduled to expire, I guess, is that the proper term? Expire in about a year. I think the main thing is just to realize that, you know, the world moves on without you, or the FAC can move on without you, and that you're not the key cog in the wheel that makes things move, that it's important to get other people involved. And I think I came to that realization within the last couple of years that, hey, there is people that can do what I do and do it as well, or if not better than I do. And that's how the FAC lives on, is through new blood and new life. And so I'm happily moving on.
I want to put another twist. I know that sometimes in smaller communities, leaders who have been, you know, the chair for maybe more than 5 years or so, don't trust that there's someone there ready to take over. How do you know when it's time to move over and or now is not time because there isn't anyone? What is that? How do you answer that question for yourself if you're thinking or wondering, should I try and move on and I don't think there's anyone to turn the reins over to?
I might answer that one with some leadership positions in my past. And I think whenever we get comfortable at a position, and that's all right for a little while, but when you get comfortable, you're not growing, you're not searching out new ways. When you get that comfortable where you're just feeling like, man, this is my spot, this is where I'm at, it's time for you to start thinking about finding the next adventure, finding the next thing that you're going to go on. I've always said this, I've said it at our FAC meeting, if you're not changing, if you're not green and growing, then you're ripe and rotting. So you've got to always be thinking about what's that next thing I'm going to do. And I don't know, if you get the mindset that this is where I fit, this is where I'm staying, then that's not right.
This is Alan. I would just say real quickly that just consider, I mean, most of us on this call, probably all of us are leaders in some effort. When was the first time you got that big shot to take on something that made you nervous? You know, can I do this? And actually, I mean, frankly, it's probably in our mid-20s, maybe 30, and we owe it to the next generation to take the reins and move over. You can still be a mentor and, you know, help out, but you don't want to be in charge, is what I say. And you have to figure your own time, but.
You have an opinion, not a vote, maybe.
Yeah,
okay.
Or maybe not even opinion, just energy, you know, to add to somebody else's.
Great. Vote. Denise, is it time? Okay, we're gonna have another breakout room, and there may be someone in your breakout session that doesn't have video or audio, but they can hear you, so they'll be taking part in the conversation without saying anything. But what we want to do is orient you towards action, which is, what action for leadership succession planning are you inspired to take back to your FAC? What action are you going to take back to your FAC around leadership succession? So enjoy, and thank you, and we'll see you in a few minutes.
I will try to be really brief and concise. So there's, I think, 3 key words that I've heard today, that if there's 3 key words to take away from this session, I think they're intentionality, teamwork, and fun. And if we can be intentional, do it as a team, and make sure we're having fun along the way, we're going to get an enormous amount of good community building work done. We have a whole number of NCF peer mentors that are a part of the discussion today. Thanks so much to our 4 panelists, as well as to the folks that were in small groups. contributing their knowledge and wisdom. And thanks to my NCF colleagues for doing an awesome job of putting this together and doing a beautiful job of facilitation. So with that, I'll just say happy holidays, blessings to you and your family, and thank you for all each of you do.